Perfect. So, hello and welcome to the EMEA Migration and Modernization Academy. My name is Lech Migdał. I'm a migration solutions architect working with partners across Europe, Middle East, and Africa on anything related to migrations. And I'll be your host for the whole series. On the last session, Andy took us through the whole migration process on rather high level. As you remember, it consists of three main phases. So assess, mobilize, and then migrate and modernize. Today, we're going to go deeper, so dive deep into the first phase, so assess. For that, I've invited my friend, Jorge Fonseca, Senior Solutions Architect from UK and I. Jorge, can you tell us a few words about yourself and what do you do with partners?
Okay, thank you, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. As you mentioned, Jorge Fonseca, Senior Solutions Architect. I have around 20 years of working in the industry, in the IT industry, and over this time, I've seen quite a lot from legacy to really modern applications and migrations, and I've been playing lots of roles from development, project manager, engagement manager, and so forth. At AWS, I've been there for 2 years. And what I mostly do is help customers to migrate to the cloud. And with that, it's been dozens of migrations that I've supported so far. I'm also focused on the worldwide migration and modernization technical field community inside AWS, and also the travel and hospitality industry vertical. That's me.
Awesome. Thank you. So, couple of points. So, logistics, right? The session is recorded. We will publish it on the Migration and Modernization website. It will also go into PartnerCast, so you'll be able to search and find it later. All of the slides that Jorge will be presenting today will be shared with you by the end of the day. You should get an email from me simply with those slides and a couple of interesting links that will be mentioned throughout the session. And also, if you have any questions, really any questions during the session, please put them into the Q&A functionality. I will try to answer some of them as we're going through slides via chat. I will also bring some of them to Jorge and maybe have some discussion with him to get to you like a cool and proper answers. With that, I'd say, Jorge, so what is the plan for today?
Okay, so the plan for today. We have three main topics that we're going to address. First, we're going to recap the common drivers of migration and modernization. Although you have seen the session, the previous session, and as mentioned, it's about onions, but let's recap to see where we are. Then we'll dive into the relevance of the assess phase, which is the phase that we're going to focus on today. And we're going to ask, what does an effective assessment look like? So that's the main three topics. So with that, let's start with migrate and modernize. So as SAs and as migration expert, SAs meaning solutions architects and migration experts and professionals within this domain, we sometimes take for granted the cloud migration benefits. And it's good to remember the basic premises to be able to help our customers. Not all customers have that idea set in stone. So these ideas are that the abstraction of the underlying infrastructure, either being cloud architectures, managed services, containerization, or serverless, this sort of abstraction results in cost savings via the elasticity of the cloud. And by elasticity, I mean being able to scale the workloads up and down according to business needs, and being able to be elastic both horizontally and vertically. This often also results in fewer security incidents, and in general, it does result in substantial productivity boosts for the customers and for the organizations. Good to have that in mind. However, no two organizations are alike, and it is important to identify the timelines of compelling events that happen to those organizations. For example, go lives. Let's pay attention to go lives. Let's pay attention to license and contract lifetimes. Let's pay attention to major security incidents or business mergers and acquisitions. Once we have identified those compelling events, let's then work backwards from the business outcomes that those organizations are expecting and identify the stakeholders within the organizations and their own motivations. We can then map those outcomes to well-known technological journeys, and this includes the assets or processes that help on those journeys migrating to the cloud. And with that, we should help customers to draft a narrative so that they can pitch the stakeholders. And these are the stakeholders from customers, but also partners like yourselves and the AWS internal stakeholders as well. So getting all of those stakeholders involved. What is the assess phase anyway, and what does it solve? Well, there are certain interesting questions. And again, don't assume that everyone knows what are the cloud benefits and the roadmap to the cloud. So we want to ask, or customers ask, in terms of visibility. So when there are mergers and acquisitions and new leaderships and partner handovers, what does the organization hold? How can we discover that? But also in situations where you are in multi-cloud, or you're defining a public or private cloud, or you try to understand if you want to migrate your applications or your infrastructure only. Another question is how to create momentum, internal momentum with internal stakeholders by creating a compelling business case. And finally, how do we identify gaps and risks that need to be mitigated? So these are all common questions that arise right at the beginning of an intention to migrate. And these are the questions that the assess phase will try to answer. So what are the challenges then in terms of people, in terms of stakeholders? Several challenges here. For example, it's typical, or it's normal to see siloed cloud approaches, several teams with different approaches within the customer, some more advanced than others. So it's important to identify and support those cloud champions that are spearheading the initiatives, and then identify all stakeholders and their motivations, and define a communication strategy and a cadence for that communication strategy, a bit like project management. So let's get people involved in this initiative of migration, and then create the momentum. To know that, we also need to know in what stage the customer is in. For those who remember the cloud adoption framework or the journey to the cloud. So this is about understanding what are the mechanisms that we need to have to assess the customer stages of adoption, cloud adoption, and then try to match that to the customer's expectations so that we don't miss it. Identify any blockers, risks, any concerns, and then eventually do a learning needs analysis to find out about enablement gaps. So do all of the teams, development teams, migration teams, infrastructure teams, do they know everything that they need to know? So identify those gaps as well. That's important. Also identify the culture of the company. So how is the mindset? Is the mindset driven for change, or do you need to change that mindset, change the culture from an on-prem or legacy mindset into a cloud and elastic mindset? So all of that will help to build a plan of action once we actually start the migration. And all of this is collected during the assess phase primarily. Of course, you will continue to do some more gathering of information throughout the migration. And when I say throughout the migration, I'm talking about this diagram here. So these are the 3 stages of a cloud migration according to the AWS standards, of course. So in this, we have the assessment phase. And by assessment, this is the idea of getting that information so that we can then take informed decisions. And this is something that can be done in days or can be done in weeks. It really depends on the complexity of the workload and and the rush. So how fast does the customer want to move? From the assess phase, we move on to the mobilize phase. This is the getting ready phase. So this is where you start migrating something, the first workloads, and then learn with that and repeat. And you prepare for the wider migration or the full migration in the third phase. On the mobilize, the one in the middle, is also where you define the landing zone. What do VPCs look like, for example? How will security look like? And then you migrate those first applications to test and create modules. And then finally, you move on to the migrate and modernize phase, where you actually accelerate the migration at scale.
George, before you move forward, I have like a couple of questions here. So nice diagram, right? We've seen it already. We know that this is this best practice-based migration process. But I wonder, like, if customer has not yet decided to move to AWS or to move to the cloud, why they should do the assess phase, or what are the benefits for them for starting with assess phase?
That's a common question that I hear. And what I usually tell the customers is that the assess phase is cloud provider agnostic. It doesn't really matter where the customer will go. They might choose another cloud provider, or they might decide to stay on-prem. Nonetheless, the assess phase will help to do an informed decision. So they will know what they have. Imagine if you have a new leader within the organization, understanding the organization, regardless of where they go, is always helpful. And this is typically supported free of charge from AWS. So it's a fantastic opportunity for customers.
So second question, like I see here discovery mentioned in assess and in mobilize. We've slightly touched on it yesterday, but can you remind us, like, what's the difference between the rapid discovery in assess and discovery and planning in the mobilize phase?
Okay. So when we say rapid discovery, it has to do with the time we want to take to collect the information. Not all decisions have to be taken with all of the information or with 90% of the information. If you can get some information, that will help to drive the next points of decision. For example, you can leverage whatever information the customer has already. So they might have had a previous assessment, an assessment from a third party, or you can take snapshot information from their current systems or from previous business cases that they have provided, any ongoing conversation. So get your hands on that information that is available and start working with it immediately. So the idea is don't get into analysis paralysis. Get something and start working.
Okay.
Okay. And that's actually a good segue for the next slide, where we dive a little bit into this. So there are certain mechanisms that are provided by AWS to help customers and partners to go through the assess phase, and I have a few icons here that address what I was just talking about. These mechanisms are the migration evaluator tool, which does sorry, it was previously called TSO, but now it's been acquired by AWS, and we've rebranded. But it allows you to do a discovery. Then you have a workshop called Migration Readiness Assessment, also known as MRA, to understand the stakeholders. And you have the Migration Hub, which is one of the services within the AWS console that helps you track all of the migration. On top of that, also remember that you have lots of assets provided by AWS. You have training, documentation, you have the AWS support team, and you also have the guidance from the technical teams, the solution architects aligned with your accounts, and also the partner solution architects and all of the specialists to help on that phase.
So maybe, again, a couple of questions from my end, if you don't mind. I see on the left side a couple of potential sources of data: asset inventory, application configuration, CMDB, SLAs, OLAs. What about monitoring tools? So if a customer already has a proper, robust end-to-end monitoring solution deployed, can this data be also used for some purpose in this assessment?
Yes, it falls into the example that I was giving before. Whatever the information has, whatever the customer has in terms of information to help discover and assess what is the inventory that they have and how is the usage of those resources, all of that helps. Actually, tools like the AWS Migration Evaluator, they allow you to import whatever you export from those services for example, for CMDB from your customer, you can export the information from there or any other inventory tool, and then import into Migration Evaluator, and it will help to map those resources into AWS resources. So either from a snapshot perspective, or we call it also reserved capacity, or from a usage perspective to get you a better right sizing estimate. We will dive into that as well on the next slides. So we'll come back to this, okay?
Cool. And will you talk about the duration of the assess phase again? I believe you've mentioned it already, but are you planning to cover it later?
Yes, we have a slide just for that, and I'll dive into that duration.
Cool, thank you.
Fantastic. Then moving on to the next topic, how to do an effective assessment. Well, for an effective assessment, the most important thing is to know what is the environment, to know what is the scope of the migration. So on that context, what we need to do is to map the resources to the workloads that we want to migrate. And by workload, we mean the functionalities, the group of functionalities that we are migrating to the cloud, excuse me. And then map those workloads to capabilities of the company. So what are the business benefits of those workloads? Then assess the stakeholders' risk appetite, typically the owners of those workloads. How willing are they to move to the cloud? Then look at legacy workloads with unknown dependencies. These are the situations where we have something that we know that is working, but we don't know exactly what it is and how it works or where it connects to. At that point, we might want to consider an application agnostic migration, also called infrastructure migration or lift and shift migration, where we just pick all of the infrastructure and move it somewhere, regardless of the applications that are running there. So this is a decision point. We also have to consider workloads managed by third parties. You might have a company managing just a specific database or specific cluster. This is very normal. And then do a cloud agnostic exercise, which is understand the benefits of the on-premises operations and the benefits of that journey to the cloud, regardless of being a journey to AWS or not. And when to do this? So get those triggers, for example, when new leaders are joining the organization, get those opportunities and work with those stakeholders, those champions that want to do this. Another perspective of getting the assessment right was that slide that I just mentioned to you. So it has to do with the period that we want to analyze this. So there are two concepts here. One concept is reserved capacity. By reserved capacity, we mean the amount of resources that are allocated to specific workloads. So someone has bought that hardware, for example. The other perspective is the effective usage, which means how much those resources are actually being used. So percentage of CPU, memory utilization, disk, so forth. By looking at effective usage, we can get the right-sized estimate for the migration, meaning only the resources within the cloud that are necessary for a normal workload. And then we work with things like spot instances and elasticity, auto-scaling to be able to accommodate the peaks. Another thing to be aware of is the opportunity cost of the reserved capacity. So how much will you get by getting rid of that hardware, and also how much long do you have that hardware for? So for example, look at the opportunity value of licenses, of operating systems, contracts that you might have, contracts with people, security, maintenance, all of those things. And finally, look at the historical business impact of the downtime. So how much does it cost to have your company offline? So people probably remember what happened yesterday with a few of social networks. What is the impact of that? So understanding this cycle of your company, understanding the difference between reserved capacity and the effective usage is quite important to get that estimate right.
Yeah. So, George, a question, and I think it slightly aligns with what I asked earlier. So, you talked about right sizing, right? So, how long do you think partners or customers should monitor utilization of servers to do a proper right sizing?
It typically depends on the business cycle of the organization. So for example, if you have a betting companies typically have their peaks over the weekend. So you want to go through an entire week because you know that during the week it's slower than on the weekend is higher. So they have weekly cycles and you can monitor just 1 week and that's okay. But if you have an accounting teams work in monthly cycles. So your taxes, for example, for that, you should look at the entire month. Some companies are even more complex and you need 6 months or 1 year of a cycle, which might be overwhelmed for one specific migration, but they might have data about it. Understand the business of the company and the business cycle, and you will know how much time you will need you'll need to measure to get the right size. Also, question if you really need it. For example, why are you calculating the right size? Is this because the customer is still trying to decide if they're going to migrate from on-premises to the cloud? Some customers have already decided that they want to migrate to the cloud. So they just want to know what is the quickest way to deploy. And probably the quickest way to deploy is to map it to the reserved capacity. And then they will scale down to accommodate the usage while they are already on AWS. So at that point, probably looking at a period is not necessary. On the other hand, if you're looking at a discount program threshold from AWS, for example, so a funding program wants to know what is the opportunity value within the reserved capacity. So they want to know how much the customer has on-prem, and they want to value that. So when you're applying to funding programs, I would say not necessary to look at the use capacity. If you look at the reserved capacity and pitch that as the opportunity, as the size of the opportunity, that is enough. So quick snapshot, just one day or 1 hour looking at the data and looking at the infrastructure, or just get an inventory, that's more than enough. Finally, there are situations where you are in a competitive pitch or competitive situation where either the customer is looking at other cloud providers or private cloud providers, or they want to stay on-prem. On those situations, yes, analyze the business cycle and get the right sizing. So bottom line, don't always go for right sizing. It really depends on what is the situation you are in, and the duration of the right sizing. It also depends on the business cycle of the company.
And then I assume the length of the duration of the assess phase is dependent on that time that you use to collect data, correct? So I think that's the main driver, in fact.
Exactly. So because it will create that dependency, understand how fast the customer wants to go. You might be blocking the customer, especially if the customer already wants to move to AWS or to move to the cloud. You might be blocking the customer. So take that informed decision and based on your current situation. And talking about data. Usage of good data. We all know that bad inputs result in wrong conclusions. So wrong conclusions drive to frustrated expectations, and I've seen even customers going back to on-prem, which is kind of counterintuitive. So a long and painful manual process can be avoided. How? By using automated tools that bring this analysis from months to days. Which tools are those? Well, there's a slide here with lots of them. Let me start with Migration Evaluator, which is the one that AWS bought in 2019, previously called TSO, as I've mentioned. But you also have plenty other ones, Application Discovery Service, Migration Portfolio Assessment. You have also the AWS Calculator, which is more than enough for a what we call a snapshot estimate. Then you have other applications that go through very interesting dependencies. For example, Application Discovery Service understands network dependencies between components, and that can help you to create a dependency map where you know what is the sequence of modules or sequence of applications that you need to migrate, in which order you need to migrate your applications.
And so we have those tools from AWS. Are there any specific, and from our technology partners, like, are there any specific scenarios where you see partners, our consulting partners, choose those technology partner tools over AWS services? Like if you could name a couple of them.
Yes. So I can give you two examples from the top of my head. Cloudomize, I've seen it being used for Windows license assessments, where you have lots of Windows workloads. And another one is Device42. I've seen it being used for mainframes and for legacy workloads, and even to assess the assets of other cloud providers. But overall, there are very interesting tools that can capture and analyze data inside the walls of the customers and get some really nice insights. What I would say is leverage your own experience. If a partner already has experience with one specific tool, one specific discovery tool, it's probably best to compare it to the other solutions, and you might see that the benefit that you get from already knowing that tool is much better than just testing all of them. So take a wise decision on that one. But let me dive into the Migration Evaluator again, because I mean, this is the one that AWS focus on in terms of support. This one allows you to do a technical deployment straight away. And what you need is a Windows instance, and then it uses agentless connectors to bring back the technical information to a central location that you control. It also supports VMware, Hyper-V, and a number of bare metal servers and even SQL Server. But alternatively, if you already have an existing inventory initialization data, you can provide that as a flat file, and you can import into Migration Evaluator, and that binds to the previous conversations that we had. And once it is completed, the data gathering, it can then produce, Migration Evaluator can then produce a number of different deliverables with different cost perspectives based on the choices that you have available. These outputs can be directly used to support the business case for migrations and to present to the customer all of your conclusions.
Before we move on, I want to mention one thing. So I got a couple of questions how we can get access to Migration Evaluator. I'll send you a link to a PDF describing how partners can request involvement of Migration Evaluator team, and how you can and how customers can request involvement of Migration Evaluator team. You will get it in that email from me. And George, a question for you. Like, here we're talking about servers. There is a bit about SQL Server, but what about databases? I mean, let's be honest, we have a lot of databases in source environments. So what can we do about those?
Very well. I think it's in my slides because that was exactly the next slide. Very well. The databases are slightly different in terms of what we need to do. So several perspectives. One of them is the technical validation. For technical validation, I mean, can this database, or when you're looking at a database, can this database actually be migrated? And that really depends on the database engine. So having a tool that is aware of the database engine is important. One of them is the schema conversion tool provided by AWS free of charge that will allow you to analyze if you can migrate from engine X to Y. So I don't know, from SQL Server on-prem to PostgreSQL, something like that, from Oracle, PostgreSQL to MySQL, that sort of conversions. So you run it on your local database and it will generate a report telling you if it is possible to migrate or not, and where are the blockers. So what are the functionalities that you might have on your on-premise or your source database that you need to tackle, analyze, and we'll give you some solutions on what to do next. Another perspective is the licensing costs. So here we usually take a case-by-case assessment. There are some tools that will already provide you some insights on what licenses you need to convert to when you jump into AWS. But I've seen business development managers also using spreadsheets with some inputs that they request additional to what the tools usually expose, some additional information about the database, and with that they create the right license estimation based on the contracts that the customers have. For example, we know that some database providers have almost unique contracts for each customer, especially in the enterprise ones. So factoring that is important. Additionally, there is a program called Database Freedom that is related with the benefits of the modern, let's call it the modern database engines. So since the advert of NoSQL and time-stream databases and so forth. So doing an assessment on database aligned with domain-driven architectures is also a good and interesting thing to do. And finally, when we're in the presence of SaaS providers, software as a service providers, they usually have tenant segregated databases where a specific customer is either on one single database or it's on a tenant within a cluster. Well, there are some mechanisms there. The problem is how to size the migration of distinct tenants for a software as a service provider. For that, we use a technique called T-shirt sizing, where we kind of select model customers or model databases, and then extrapolate the cost of all of the migration by those models by applying T-shirt sizes, large, small, medium, that sort of thing to get into an estimation. Hope that wasn't too long, and hope it addressed your question. So moving to business cases. How to create a business case. Important thing to remember, the business case that we want at the assess phase is an initial version. So this is something like a pitch with one paragraph of text. Or if you want to make it a little longer, we're talking about a narrative with one or more pages. The idea is it is not exhaustive. So don't fall again into the analysis paralysis. You just want to ensure that everyone is aligned on what the migration is about so that you set that direction to move forward. So what do you want from the business case? Well, first, look at the organization and stakeholder drivers, and then look at compelling events like we have just mentioned, things that trigger the migration. And with that, understand the cost of the opportunity. So in terms of innovation and agility that the company might be missing out. And with that, there's an interesting workshop called Amazon Culture of Innovation. And then on top of that, understand what are the business outcomes. This would be the structure of your narrative, okay? On the other hand, there is the perspective of cloud economics, and this is about breaking down of costs. What you want to do here is to understand the future cost on the cloud, so mapping the resources into AWS. And here we're talking about the reserve capacity and the right sizing. So getting the estimates for both of them, it's a good practice. Another thing is to include modernization. How can you reduce the cost once you go to AWS by moving into modern architectures? And then apply the funding programs on top of that. As for tools, you can use AWS Calculator, the Migration Evaluator, or any of the tools that we've seen before to do that. Another perspective is the current total cost of ownership, or TCO, of being on-prem. Basically, what you want to compare is if you move to the cloud, this is how it will cost, but if you stay on-prem, this is how it is costing you. And customers also don't have that visibility very clear. Why? Because they typically look at the resources that they are using, but there are other factors. So how much money you spend on people and people allocation, the time, also licenses, energy, space allocation, your security team, all of those things can be factored into the estimate. And with that, there's a tool called Portfolio Assessment Tool that has some very interesting assumptions and can help you get to those values. On top of that, you also want to know the cost of the migration. So how much will the customer spend in time and materials, plus the work of the partners? And then the commissioning cost, which is the cost of exiting the current data center, because that also has a cost.
And maybe one comment from my end. So there'll be a session delivered by Cloud Economics team, and that will go deeper into this whole cloud economics aspect that you may want to register. So.
Okay, thank you. And about funding programs, that will be touched on that session. And so we have AWS has PLC credits, the Windows Rapid Migration Program, Database Freedom, but also has the MAP program, which is the most interesting one in terms of discount. Do remember that to get some of these fundings, you need to need to have the migration competency or partner migration competency. So check with your partner success manager if you are there and what are the steps to move forward to get access to this. Also reach out to your go-to-market specialist for MAP and the MAP champions that are associated with the customer. So following your tip, there's a deep dive session on November 15, which partners will require to sign an NDA to be able to be on that session or have an NDA already signed for that. Okay.
George, another question for MAP, and we're kind of talking about MAP on a high level on each and every session, but can you clarify who signs the MAP? So it's like is it like AWS signing migration acceleration program terms with customer or with partner or both?
It depends on the good solution architect answer. It's usually between AWS and the customer, except when the customer is billing through a partner. So there are situations where the billing comes from the partner and the customer pays to the partner, and then the billing goes from partner to AWS. Only on those specific situations, the agreement is signed between AWS and the partner. Everything else is direct agreement between AWS and the customer. The partner then comes along with a statement of work and the other additions to the migration.
And all of those details will be covered on November 15th and November 16th. I think also we're going to cover like a details of funding request process there. So yeah, makes sense.
Thank you. And talking about partners and business case, also don't forget to promote the know-how of the partner. AWS data shows that customers who use a consultancy partner, they get typically their migrations done 25% faster. And another dimension that we observe is that during migration and modernization, IT departments choose not to want to do some work, whether it be infrastructure management or network modernization or application development. So a partner can offload that undesired work. My suggestion is show that this frees up the customer to focus on the skills that they want to develop. Show the value that you bring to a big customer. And moving on to the MRA, the Migration Readiness Assessment. This is one of the benefits that the partners can deliver. The MRA is a workshop based on the 6 categories of the Cloud Adoption Framework. It helps to evaluate customers' cloud competency, capability, and commitment, and identifies gaps to address during the migration readiness and planning. It is conducted as a one-day workshop or through interviews with the stakeholders. And these interviews have around 80 questions, which depend on the type of workload that we are assessing.
And like the common question, sorry, with regards to the previous slide also, like the common question I get here, so maybe you have some opinion, like who delivers MRA? Is it AWS? Is it partner?
It's another question which will get the depends answer. This can be done by the partner, but it also can be done jointly with AWS. So you have the account SA on the customer that you're working with. So the account SA can help or can perform or can lead the migration, the migration readiness assessment, or a migration specialist within AWS. There are benefits on partners doing this, but also remember that you can also have the support of all these stakeholders within AWS. Okay. In terms of the structure of the MRA, the questions are broken into 2 major groups, which are business and technology. The business group includes business value realization, people and governance, and the technical group includes platform security and operations. And during the session, customer stakeholders, they submit the rating online, and you as a facilitator, you dive in and you look for consensus within those answers. So for customers, the MRA is really about consensus and alignment for the migration that is to come, while for partners, it's an opportunity for understanding the customer and building that trust. As an outcome, the manifestation of the MRA is mostly facilitated by the web tool. So you get the Cloud Adoption Framework alignment on this image on the left, and you have the subcategories and the questions, and finally you have the ratings and the observations. Again, excellent opportunity to propose follow-up actions backed by these data points that will both align the migration and give you the trust and build that trust with the customer.
George, you're mentioning a tool here, specific tool, migration readiness assessment tool that is provided for free to partners, right? But do partners have to use that tool or that specific migration readiness assessment methodology?
Certain funding programs like MAP, they require some sort of assessment. However, that assessment does not need to be the MRA. It can be any other assessment workshop that can bring the same sort of value. However, in my experience, these assessments, they provide insights about customer readiness, and they can discover potential blockers and opportunities for partners. Doing them is important. The tool itself, not so important. If you don't know where to start, that is a good one. If you already have some sort of another assessment on the customer with another tool, just go for it. That's also valid.
And maybe another question. So you were talking about the next steps, so the recommendations that partners create as the output of the MRA. How they are used later by partners and customers?
How they are used? It's about the mobilize phase and then the migration phase. Getting those insights will help to set a direction, will help to identify gaps that need to be addressed, will help to identify risks that need to be mitigated, and that will build a more successful migration in the future. You don't want to discover those things, and you don't want to think about those things once you already within the migration. You will get your stakeholders confused, upset. You will fail on expectations. So get those insights and get the people as soon as possible. Understand the expectations of your stakeholders as soon and as early as possible, and then pick up the actionables from the tool and address those concerns.
And is it fair to say that on one hand, when we're talking about migration evaluator, for example, we're doing infrastructure data collection, while the other side of the coin is like MRA looking more at the process and people aspects, so higher level but still critical for the migration? Like
yes,
two sides of the same coin?
It is fair to say it also includes technological questions on a high level, but I would say that the great differentiator is the people aspect and the business aspect. Although it contains both, the people and business aspect is the differentiator.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Now, I also understand that 80 questions on an assessment might be overwhelming. So there is an alternative for that. So there is something called the Cloud Adoption Readiness tool that only has 16 questions and 6 perspectives. So using this one is an alternative if you think that the 80 questions is overwhelming. However, again, see it as a business opportunity that benefits all parts. Don't go through the questions, the 80 or the 16, as a checkbox exercise. You find the gaps, get the actionables, and then create the plan to move forward.
And one thing that I may want to add, and I'm sorry, I always add a lot of stuff at the end of the session. So for the card, how you may want to treat it is also a way to show to the customer, this is what we want to achieve with MRA, because it's very often hard to show to the customer, let's go through all of the MRA questions to explain to you the value. While with card, these are 16 questions, so you can just show them really quickly. These are the questions I want to ask you with the migration readiness assessment. So the full service, let me show you what is the potential benefit. And this may open their eyes and they'll be like, wow, yes, now I get it. Let's do it properly with a migration readiness assessment. So this is how we can also use the card.
Very interesting approach indeed as well. So wrapping up with actionable next steps. We're getting close to the end on that. And I think this slide is a good summary of what we need to do on, or what we need to focus on the assessment phase. So number 1, use discovery tools to calculate the right-sized estimates. So this is right sizing to leverage the elasticity of the cloud, but also do a total cost of ownership analysis, or TCO analysis, of both on-premises and on the cloud to see the benefit of moving from one to the other. Number 2, build a business case with the stakeholder drivers, the migration scope, and the migration benefits, and finally, the cloud economics, which includes funding programs like MAP, but there are many others that you can leverage. Number 3, and last, bring customer stakeholders together with an MRA or cloud readiness assessment. Overall, remember that organizations are made of people first and foremost. So bring them along with the organization, with the migration. Finally, don't forget to register for additional sessions from our colleagues. We have tomorrow mobilize phase, which is the next phase right after the assess that we've looked at today. On the 14th, we have a deep dive on business cases, how to create a business case that is quite compelling. On the 27th, we have a deep dive into the MRA, the Migration Readiness Assessment. November 8th, we have a deep dive into the Application Discovery Service, which is one of the services that AWS provides to do the discovery. And finally, on November 15th, we have a deep dive on the funding programs. And that was it. So thank you for your time, and we are now open for questions. So I know that the slides will be sent later by email. there is a survey that I would love for you to fill in to give us that feedback. It will also be sent later, and I'm open for additional questions from you.
Yes. So